History was not always written in light. Some stories were born in silence under cold rain, where broken weapons sank into the mud and smoke covered the truth. On fields like this, victory and defeat looked almost the same. A crown could rise, an army could fall, but the earth remembered only footsteps, blood, and ash. But somewhere beyond the noise of kings, beyond the screams of soldiers, there was something else. A figure in the dark, a witness who never chose a side. He does not fight. 5 centuries before Christ, one empire stretched farther than any kingdom the world had ever seen. From Egypt to Anatolia, from royal roads to distant mountains, Persia moved like a shadow across the ancient world. Its roads carried orders, taxes, armies, and fear. Dozens of peoples lived beneath one throne, speaking different languages, praying to different gods, yet answering to the same king. At the center of it all sat Darius the Great. To his subjects, he was not merely a ruler. He was the king of kings, the voice of an empire too vast for one man to fully see. But power this large always casts a longer shadow. And somewhere at the edge of the throne, hidden behind stone, rain, and smoke, the witness watched the empire breathe. But far from the throne, on the western edge of the empire, a smaller fire began to breathe. In the Ionian cities, fear turned into whispers, and whispers became rebellion. These cities had lived beneath Persian rule, but they still remembered their own names, their own streets, their own pride. And when Athens and Eretria reached across the sea, the revolt no longer stood alone. Help came by ship, through rain and black water. It was not enough to defeat Persia, but it was enough to insult it. And empires remember insults long after cities forget why they fought. The revolt was crushed. Streets burned, walls broke, and the voices of defiance vanished beneath ash and rain. But Darius did not forget. For him, this was not rebellion. It was a wound. In the palace of Darius, the flames of the revolt had gone out, but the insult remained. A small city across the sea had dared to touch the empire. They say he ordered a servant to remind him every day. Remember the Athenians. Not because Athens was powerful, but because it had crossed a line. From that moment, Greece was no longer distant. It became unfinished business, a name carried through palace halls, through maps, through memory, and through revenge. And so the machine of empire began to move, not with rage alone, but with roads, ships, orders, and men. The first march toward Greece had begun. The first march began in the north. Through Thrace, through rain, through mud, the empire moved west. Not as a rumor anymore, but as soldiers, horses, wagons, and command. Thrace was forced back beneath Persian control. Macedon bowed before the pressure. For Darius, these were not victories to celebrate. They were roads being cleared, stones moved from the path to Greece. Then came the sea. Persian ships gathered under black clouds, their wooden hulls groaning in the storm. Across the Aegean, islands waited, listening to the thunder and the oars. This was only the beginning. Before Athens could be punished, the empire tested the roads, the coast, the islands, and the sea. Greece was no longer watching from afar. Persia was coming closer. The Persian fleet moved island by island. Naxos felt the weight of the empire first. Across the dark water, sails appeared like shadows, and the Aegean began to understand what was coming. Then came Eretria. The city had helped the revolt, and now the empire stood at its walls. Around it, fires burned in the rain, and every flame looked like a warning. Eretria fell. Its walls broke, its streets filled with smoke, and the punishment was made visible for every Greek city that still thought the empire could be ignored. And now, Athens waited. The city that had helped the rebels was next in the path of revenge. Across the water, Persia had already chosen its answer. At Marathon, the Persians finally stepped onto Athenian ground. The sea was behind them, the plain ahead, and somewhere beyond the fog, Athens was waiting for the blow. Across the field, the Athenians stood with far fewer men. Their shields were heavy, their armor wet, and every soldier knew that if this line broke, Athens would have no wall left. The Persians had numbers, ships, and the confidence of empire. The Athenians had a narrow chance, a desperate plan, and a field that would decide whether Greece could stand at all. Then the order came. Not to wait, not to hide behind fear, but to run. Across the mud, through the rain, straight toward the army of the King of Kings. Then the Athenians moved, not slowly, not carefully, but with the speed of men who knew they could not survive a longer fight. Across the mud, they ran straight into history. The impact was sudden. Bronze met flesh. Shields met panic. What looked like an easy Persian advance became confusion, pressure, and collapse. The Persians pulled back. What should have been a punishment was turning into a warning. Men ran for the ships, and the field of Marathon began to change its meaning. When it was over, the impossible had happened. The empire had been pushed back. Marathon was no longer just a place. It became proof that Persia could bleed, and that Greece could survive. From Marathon, a messenger ran toward Athens. Whether history remembers his name clearly or not, the image remained. One man, one road, and a city waiting to hear if it had survived. The story of that run became legend. A breathless arrival, a message of victory, and then silence. For Athens, it meant life. For Persia, it meant humiliation. Darius had expected punishment. Instead, he received a wound. Marathon did not destroy Persia, but it broke something more dangerous. The idea that Persia could not lose. Darius prepared another invasion, a larger one, a final answer. But death came before revenge, and the unfinished war passed to his son. The crown did not end the war. It only changed the man who carried it. After Darius, the throne passed to Xerxes, and with it, a debt of revenge. Xerxes did not inherit only a kingdom. He inherited a story of insult, a failed punishment, and a father's unfinished command. This time, Greece would not face a raid. It would face an empire. So the preparations began. Men were gathered, ships were readied, roads were measured, bridges were planned. Xerxes was not preparing to punish one city. He was preparing to break a world. When the army stood ready, the horizon itself seemed crowded. To the Greeks, it would feel endless. To Xerxes, it was destiny. To the witness, it was only another shadow moving toward blood. Before the army could reach Greece, it had to cross the water. So Xerxes ordered the sea itself to become a road. Ships were bound together, ropes tightened, and the empire began to bridge the impossible. Then the army crossed. Men, horses, wagons, and banners moved over the waves. For the Greeks, this was no longer a distant threat. The storm had stepped onto the road. The march became a moving city. Not just soldiers, but animals, supplies, servants, engineers, and fear. Every step carried the empire deeper toward the heart of Greece. In Greece, fear became a council. Old rivals sat beneath the same roof, because the threat was too large for one city to face alone. For the first time, survival mattered more than pride. All eyes turned to Sparta, a city built around discipline, pain, and war. While others debated survival, Sparta had been training for death since childhood. But even Sparta had laws. A sacred festival was underway, and the full army could not march. Leonidas would not be given thousands. He would be given 300. 300 men walked into a war that did not promise return. They were not enough to defeat an empire. But sometimes, history does not ask who can win. It asks who will stand. They chose Thermopylae, the hot gates, a narrow wound between mountain and sea. There, a small force could become a wall, and time itself could become a weapon. At the hot gates, the Greeks became a wall, shield pressed against shield, spear beside spear, until the narrow pass itself seemed to grow teeth. The first answer was arrows. They came like black rain hissing over the pass. But bronze and wood held, and the wall did not break. Then came the men. Wave after wave pressed into the narrow mouth of the pass. But numbers meant little there. The mountain and the sea had stolen Persia's greatest strength. The Spartans did not fight like scattered men. They moved like a machine. One line tired, another replaced it, and the wall again and again held. Xerxes watched wave after wave fail. The pass was too narrow, the Greeks too disciplined, and the empire too large to use its own strength. For the king, this was impossible to accept. That night, the Greeks were still alive, tired, wet, and surrounded by numbers they could barely imagine. But the pass had held, and for one more night, Greece had time. But battles are not always broken by force. Sometimes, one whisper is enough. A man named Ephialtes knew a hidden path, and he carried that secret toward the Persian fires. The path curved behind the Greek line. It did not need to be wide. It only needed to exist. And once Xerxes knew of it, Thermopylae was no longer a wall. It was a trap. By dawn, Leonidas knew the truth. The pass had been turned. The enemy was no longer only in front of him. It was coming from behind. And every choice now carried death. So Leonidas chose both survival and sacrifice. Most of the Greeks were sent away, so they could fight another day. But some remained, not because they could win, but because someone had to hold the end. 300 Spartans stayed. 700 Thespians stayed with them. Others remained too, some by choice, some by fate. The pass had become a grave, and still they stood inside it. History is never only about kings and battles. It is about choices, sacrifice, fear, and the shadows left behind. If you want more stories like this, stay with the Shadow Witness. If you want more dark historical stories like this, subscribe to the Shadow Witness. Like the video, and write in the comments which chapter of history you want the witness to see next.